Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Carole Hooven. Carole teaches in and co-directs the undergraduate program in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. She has a BA in psychology. She has a PhD from Harvard, where she mostly focuses on sex differences and testosterone, and has taught at Harvard for the past 15 years. She is the author of the new book, T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. And that's what we talk about in this episode. We first start out by talking about some of her reasons for writing the book and what she hopes readers get out of it. We talk about sex hormones and the sexual reproductive system and the impact that sexual selection has had on the development of the reproductive system. We talk about definitions of male and female within biology, which includes genetics, hormones, gametes. We talk about the impact of culture and environment on gender and biological sex. We talk about how hormones are distributed throughout the body. We discuss secondary sex characteristics in puberty. We talk about the fascinating Mullerian and Wolffian ducts. We talk about different examples of how hormones interact with the environment. And we also talk about how we can better understand issues of gender, sex within our culture and our environment. I have to say that Carole is a lovely person. She is very kind. And I say this in the episode that her book, and I think you'll hear from the conversation, is she is a very balanced person. She is not, from my estimation, politically motivated. She doesn't have an agenda. She enjoys biology. And she is perfectly fine with many people that debate many aspects of the expression of many things. What she feels passionate about and what she feels is important based on the conversation in her book is, how do we talk about the facts of biology and how can we understand them to further have equality for many people? And I know that this topic can be controversial at times, but I have to say, definitely not for myself, and my impression from Carole is there's no ounce of animus towards anybody that is trying to understand these issues. I see her primarily as a very compassionate and balanced educator. And I think that's her intentions and her motives. And I hope that comes through in the conversation that we have. And so I hope that as you listen to the conversation, you're able to really walk away with that piece of it. You may agree or may not agree with everything she says, and that's okay. But I think the point is to try and understand what her passion and motivation is. She's very clear about that, and she wants to just know the facts about biology, including the facts about culture, environment, society, gender, etc. And so it's an important conversation. Her book is fantastic. I highly encourage all of the listeners to pick it up and read it. It's very, very readable, very digestible. And so now I bring you Carole Hooven. I'm here with Carole Hooven. Carole, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this.
Thanks so much for having me, Xavier.
All right, so tell folks a little bit, just real quick, snapshot of who you are, and then we'll get into your new book.
So I got a PhD at Harvard in 2004, and my dissertation research was on sex differences in cognition. I was looking at spatial ability and how it relates to testosterone. And after I finished my PhD, I decided I wanted to stick with teaching. And although I loved research. I really, really loved teaching and ended up just staying at Harvard as kind of a permanent lecturer, which is an unusual position to be in. And I can do that because I also co-direct the undergraduate program in human evolutionary biology. So I have this dual role. So my passion is undergraduates and science education primarily. And I'm known for one course primarily, which is called Hormones and Behavior. And I had a book come out in July called T, the story of testosterone, the hormone that dominates and divides us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was just going to mention the book. It's I thought it was a cool title because it's just a letter. It's T, which is cool. Obviously, it's a cool subtitle as well. So I know this came out. So is this the book come out as a way of saying, here's all of my experience lecturing, teaching, working with folks, being in, lab. Did it come out of that, or what was the primary motivation for writing I guess you could say popular science book for gen population?
Yeah, it definitely originated with my just enthusiasm for the topic, my students' enthusiasm, their kind of thirst for the truth about what makes us who we are and how hormones contribute to really, really, in really powerful ways that we don't quite all understand, really shape our behavior in profound ways. And in many ways help to explain why males and females, boys and girls, men and women are different on average. So that was one big reason. I just wanted to bring that to a general audience who's interested in science, interested in their behavior and their bodies. Mm-hmm. And the other reason was what is happening in the culture around the particularly evolutionary biology of sex and gender and of behavior more broadly. But there's a big pushback against, and this has been going on for some time, but I think it's amplified by social media primarily and journalism lately, that there is a pushback against these kinds of explanations for reasons that I don't think make sense. And we can potentially talk about all that later, but that's really what got me to write the book now, is I felt like I want to get the accurate and clear science and evolutionary biology about how we can understand sex and gender through the lens of testosterone in an unfiltered way. I have no political or social agenda other than telling the truth as I see it. And I want to help other people be inspired to do the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll say the book is a really balanced, practical, and very clear on what is and what is not, as best we know currently, about testosterone. And so that comes out in the book, and how it's written is well written, and just the kind of tone and the demeanor is, I didn't get any political or social persuasion one way or the other. It was, again, good writing. It wasn't like dry writing or reading or anything, but it was very much this, here's what we know. Here's what we know about biology. Here's what we know about socialization. Here's what we know about how these things impact and influence. And again, it was very balanced. And so I think that that's one of the, in my opinion, one of the strong points of this book, as opposed to, maybe more current books that are out there that do have that. And that's fine. Everyone has their part to play. So, but yes, it's a great book. So
thank you. I really appreciate that. And I just want to say that is what I really tried to do, was to present the evidence that has the most robust, clear support, studies that are well replicated, et cetera. So I really appreciate that. And I tried to do it through, present that evidence through a lot of storytelling. So I appreciate that feedback.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like to think I'm a pretty balanced, centrist kind of person. So the tone demeanor was fine to me, but maybe not to others, but okay. So I guess just briefly, we could talk about what testosterone is, but maybe we can just give, we can give the 5-minute version, obviously, but just an overview of kind of the biology of the sexual reproductive systems for men and women, and mostly focusing on how we have large and small gametes, how we understand the two, how we understand biological sex, et cetera, just kind of setting it up to then talk about the different androgens, et cetera.
Sure. I guess I just want to start with a little bit about what the sex hormones do, and then I can go back to
Certainly,
something
yeah.
about the reproductive systems and what it means to say that someone or any animal is male or female.
Mhm.
So one way to think about, I'm just going to say estrogen and testosterone. I'm going to call them sex hormones. Both sexes have both hormones. We have them in different levels. And females have about 10%, males have, sorry, about 10 to 20% more testosterone than women. And women typically have just very, very low levels of testosterone. And males have about 10% the level of estrogen that females have. Mm-hmm. And the testes produce the overwhelming majority of testosterone in males, about 95%. And in females, testosterone comes from the ovaries, from adrenal glands, and a small amount from some other tissues. So females are extremely sensitive to changes in testosterone and can get away with having almost none. But the way to think about what these hormones do is that they're reproductive hormones. So there are other hormones that we can talk about later if anyone's interested. Like insulin, which is not a reproductive hormone, it's a metabolic hormone. So insulin is a protein hormone that allows glucose into cells, among other functions, but that's its main function. And that helps us survive and use our energy for lots of different kinds of bodily functions. These sex hormones aren't about helping us survive. They're about helping us reproduce. And the reason that male and female animals have different levels of testosterone and estrogen is because male and female animals use very different strategies to reproduce. And I'm going to be saying to maximize reproductive success. And that is basically the number of offspring that an individual will leave over their lifetime. And differential reproductive success is what evolution works on. So the traits that are transmitted to subsequent generations, to the extent that they're coded in one's genes at a high rate, are the traits that are selected for by evolution. So sex hormones are sort of a tool of sexual selection, which is the sort of component of evolution that selects for these traits that maximize reproduction specifically.
There seems to be, what we understand about Darwin's idea of sexual evolution is that there's this aspect of mate choice, and primarily when females are, trying to select, there's this co-evolutionary piece that happens, right? So you're talking about, and we can see this all the way into the sexual ornamentation of, different animals, and then also the same with humans, although it starts to become more complex with humans, but that we understand that there's this co-evolutionary component to it. So all the way down to how hormones are for males and females as well, of this sexual selection process, or how does it work kind of at that level?
Yeah, it's that the sex hormones are really tools of sexual selection that promote the expression of the sexually selected traits in each sex that work to maximize reproductive success. And it so happens, as most people know, that in males, on average, males relative to females can increase their reproductive success by increasing access to mates. So testosterone helps males to develop and express and maintain the behavioral and physical traits that increase their access to mates, which in many, many species involves, relative to females, again, an enhanced degree of physical aggressive competition. So it depends on the environment. It depends on the species. Like in humans, physical competition, depending on the environment, might not be as important as just ability to acquire resources and ascend a status hierarchy. It might mean that you're really good at math and statistics, and you're going to use those skills to ascend a status hierarchy so you can buy a lot of land in a big house and attract more mates than the next guy. So if it's that drive to do that, that is something testosterone might promote. But it's still, in humans, we have inherited the genes that also code for a larger body size in males, say, because it's testosterone that leads to the larger body size and the enhanced muscle mass and the tendency to express physical aggression at higher rates than females. Those are testosterone mediated traits that may or may not be super useful in today's environment, but men have inherited the genes that give them higher testosterone, and that testosterone then goes and acts on other genes to increase the expression of traits that will allow males in particular to increase their reproductive success in a given environment. Sorry, so I just want to say that part of that is that high testosterone in males allows more energy to be converted into muscle. And the goal of evolution basically is to convert energy into offspring. And part of doing that for males is to convert more energy into muscle to facilitate male-male competition. And for females, estrogen allows more of that energy to be converted into fat, because ultimately fat provides energy for gestating and lactating a woman's or female animal's offspring. So you've got less risk-taking, less physical competition, the tendency to be more nurturing, live a longer, healthier life. And those are all facilitated by low testosterone and high estrogen. And then testosterone is doing something very different in males to promote male reproductive success. So that's just a way to think about the functions of the sex hormones in male and female animals. And again, it totally depends on the species and the environment and the individual, the way that these traits are developed and expressed. But another important function is to develop the reproductive structures in utero. So the actions of testosterone start very early. And you asked about sort of what it means to be male or female. There's a lot of confusion around what that means and how male and female are defined in biology. And the way that they're defined in biology, quite simply, is by the type of gamete that the organism is designed to produce. So in males, the strategy is to produce a high number of small gametes like sperm, and in females to produce a smaller number of more costly gametes like eggs. And, you know, if you are a woman and you're in menopause or you're a 5-year-old kid, you're not producing gametes, right? But you're still male or female. Mm-hmm. And that is because you have a design plan for the gametes. There are a number of reasons in many people why they may not for their whole lifetime actually produce those gametes. There are people who have differences or disorders of sexual development where they may not actually produce the gametes that would be typical of their sex, but they still have the design plan to produce those gametes. And the design plan in mammals is initiated by the differences in sex chromosomes. And of course, not all animals use sex chromosomes to determine one's sex. There could be, temperature dependent sex determination in, say, turtles. So defining sex by chromosomes is not particularly helpful. Right. In our species, yes, and in mammals, the chromosomes determine sex. So typically, if there's a Y chromosome present, then the organism, we'll just say the mammal, will develop testes. And if there is no Y chromosome present, then the organism will, by default, develop ovaries. The SRY gene on the Y chromosome, which is sex determining region of the Y chromosome, inhibits the female pathway. Mm-hmm. So if that gene is expressed and the SRY protein is present, that protein causes the undifferentiated gonads. So up until about 6 weeks, males and females are exactly alike. Right. And we have these structures which can become testes or ovaries, depending on whether the SRY gene is present and totally functional, and it causes the cells in this undifferentiated gonad to go in the male direction. So once those cells start differentiating into testicular cells under the influence of the SRY protein, then later they start producing testosterone. And it is testosterone that then takes over the rest of the masculinization of that individual. And that means masculinizing the internal and external genitalia and the brain to promote male typical sexual behavior, which like in a rat would be mounting rather than lordosis, which is, a curvature of the back to sort of receive the mounting. And that is all done by testosterone acting on genes that males and females share. So we're different, not because we have all of these different genes. Like, it's not like you have genes for a beard and I don't. If I start taking a lot of testosterone, it will start upregulating the transcription of the genes that would cause me to develop thick, dark hairs on my hair follicles. So that's where it all begins. And of course, that's just the part that happens in utero. And then there's a second wave of testosterone action in puberty that, elaborates those initial reproductive structures and then leads to the development of the secondary sex characteristics that would be useful in male-male competition and in obviously actual mating. So libido and enhanced physical aggression, among other things.
Yeah, that's very instructive, because it's the way you're laying it out is explaining this way of some of the differences, right? So we'll get to socialization later, but I think it's important to, of a sense, parse out the biological constructs and the socialization piece, because they obviously are interacting with each other many times at the same time. So, but there is enough things that are true about kind of what you're saying in terms of the program of how we understand biology. And my understanding is very similar to what you're saying. Is it's not that genitals make your biological sex. That's a part of it. It's not that your sex chromosomes, right? We have 48 pairs, right? And the 23rd is the sex chromosome, whatever. That doesn't entirely make biological sex. It really is, you could have... with external genitalia, there's different things that could happen there, but it really just matters that what you have internally, your internal organs for your reproductive system are a feature or a hallmark of what your biological sex is. And it's important, I think, from a biological perspective, that overwhelmingly it is two: large and small gametes. There's not typically a third or fourth or fifth to then.
There is just not even typically. I mean, there just isn't a third gamete. Yeah.
Right. There's no third gamete, but people, we can talk about it in a bit. Talk about some of the intersex aspects that some people like to emphasize. But there are two gametes, and so there are two. If there was four, then there would be four gametes, or six, or 7 or 10 or whatever. But there are two.
That's right.
And so this is the, if you will, first principles for how we understand biological sex as being, these two, and they're differentiated. But what you're explaining about the SRY gene and protein and how it acts on the Y chromosome, and then it, basically just switches on, and then it, generates, testosterone at that level is super important. So, but I guess my one add-on here would be, this is how we understand biology. And for the most part, none of this is historically, or for many biologists, controversial. But how do we say, and I am jumping ahead here, but how do we say along the way, so you're saying that is that 6 weeks, we're the same, not differentiated necessarily, and then we do, and there's the process what happens in utero, and then when we're born, how much are we, or how much, it's a hard question to ask, but how much can we subscribe to, at the very least, biological and environmental interactions, right? That's obviously happening for folks that are, for the woman that is pregnant, and then afterwards, and then as they're raising the, how can we understand the environment that's happening for someone's biological development?
I just want to stress that the existence of two sexes, while strongly related to who we are and how we behave and how, maybe how we identify, obviously, right? There's a very strong relationship there. Mm-hmm. The existence of two sexes does not really prevent or even have much bearing on, in some ways, the sort of ethical, the rights that someone has, or maybe the rights that they have to express themselves any way they want, right? Mm-hmm, so you can certainly be male and have something that is very much like a vagina. Mm-hmm. You can identify as female and have something like a vagina and be raised as a female, be legally female. You could even have all the rights of a female. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could be happy in that role. What I'm trying to say is that is not prevented by the fact that you might have internal testes. Right. And maybe you're not producing sperm, but you have internal testes. And if you have XY sex chromosomes and internal testes, then yeah, you're biologically male. But in a sense, after that, we have to figure out how that matters socially, legally, ethically, right? So for me, the one doesn't fully predict the other, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we should be able to disassociate these things for most purposes, that yes, there's biological sex, but then there's all this other stuff. And we have to think carefully about the relationship between biological sex and sort of everything else. It's being one sex doesn't necessitate much beyond that. It's just that ordinarily there's a whole bunch of traits that co-vary with biological sex. But in many cases, these other traits, like having breasts or vagina or feeling male or female or something else, those are on a spectrum in a sense. Even the chromosomes come in all kinds of different arrangements. Yeah. Those are features associated with sex. Those are not sex itself. Sex is not on a spectrum. Those other features may very well be on a spectrum, and that's fine. Like those things are not incompatible. So that's the point that I wanted to make there.
To follow up with that, would you, and I don't like big people get very animated and have big arguments about defining terms, which is kind of boring to me sometimes, but would you make this kind of differentiation between, how we understand our, let's say biological sex and then our gender expression? Gender can be, or do you see them as synonymous, or how do you parse that?
Oh, no. I do not see them as synonymous at all. Uh-huh. And yeah, that's what I'm trying to say, is that you could be one or the other biological sex, but then almost everything else is wide open. Yep. It doesn't limit your gender. It influences, but doesn't limit gender expression or even legal rights. Those are things that have to be obviously social and legal and ethical issues have to be worked out, and people have very different strong opinions about that. I really don't. I have strong opinions about figuring out what is real and what is true, and then letting other people figure out how to what is right. But I think you were asking before maybe about the role of culture in influencing typically feminine or masculine behavior given one's biological sex.
Yeah, the role of culture and or environment. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a huge question. And I can give you my very basic answer, which is that biological sex has an enormous influence on our predispositions, on our masculine or feminine predispositions, and does drive the differences that we observe across sexes in humans and non-human animals, which for the most part are driven by differences in testosterone and have to do with sex and physical aggression. That's just broadly. That being said, I think culture is more important because if you look at sort of across time, first of all, and across different social and cultural and ecological environments on the planet, we know that the way that one expresses their nature varies almost entirely, broadly as a function of environment. So we know, for instance, that rates of physical aggression and physical crimes basically have gone way, way down over time. That is not because of genetic changes. Yes, testosterone has dropped somewhat over time, but I don't think that's the explanation for these dramatic changes, largely in the expression of male physical aggression. We see all over the world that in some cultures, it's basically permissible for males to rape women. In other cultures, it is not permissible, or it's much, much, much less permissible. And we see huge differences in the expression of this potentially a male predisposition because of culture, because of laws, because of religion, because of social norms, because of how much food is available. There's a million factors that contribute to the expression of this predisposition. But nowhere do we see females being more physically aggressive or than males. We see nowhere that females say they want more sexual variety than males. Nowhere do we see evidence via self-report or from other kinds of evidence that females have a higher libido than males. We see the size of the sex difference change, mostly because male behavior may or may not be constrained, where female behavior is relatively unconstrained, say sexually, like in, I think, Sweden, for instance, you see a smaller sex difference in something like number of desired sexual partners because it's a more sexually egalitarian country. And so females feel relatively free to express themselves sexually. However, you still see the sex difference where males want more sexual partners. And everywhere, for instance, we see that homosexual men who obviously are having sex with other men have a higher number of sexual partners than lesbians. And this is true everywhere we look. And this is, male sexuality unconstrained by female sexual preferences. So there's lots of evidence that biology drives these differences, but that culture is incredibly important in shaping the expression of what I think are differences in our human natures.
Yeah, for listeners, the way in which Carole just explained that is very much how the book reads. It's just very balanced. Like, here's some things that we know about biology, but we also understand the cultural, environmental aspects of it. It's a balanced answer, and I think a very authentic one. So I think that's great. What about just real quick in terms of hormones in general? There's a bunch of hormones. You say there's over 75, and there's some that are in the endocrine glands and some that are in intestinal fat cells. Testosterone works in our blood as long as many other things. Just kind of explain how that's implicated on the biology of things.
Yeah. So there are something like 75 hormones. There are probably a bunch that we haven't yet identified. If I look at a list of those hormones, I don't know what half of them are because so many of them are coming from the gut, and there's new hormones discovered all the time. And I cannot keep track of all of the functions of all of the different hormones. A lot of these hormones are ones that you would have never heard of. But so testosterone and the hormones in general, when you say they work in the blood, they're transported in the blood, and they do work via the blood, say, rather than via neuronal communication, which is more like a point-to-point type of communication. Right. So hormones work more like a radio broadcast tower, sending out a signal. And any receiver that is tuned to that signal will pick up that signal and respond to it. So you've got, say, your testes are shooting out a bunch of testosterone. That testosterone is just being broadcast throughout your entire body. It's going throughout, it's transported via the blood, like all hormones, secreted from endocrine organs. And obviously the testes and ovaries are endocrine organs. They're spewing out their hormones. And what is amazing is that they're just they're in your brain. So steroid hormones just get right into your brain. They're lipophilic, which means they can pass through cell membranes with ease. So they're going everywhere, and they're interacting and affecting the activity of cells that have receptors for the particular hormone. So estrogen, that would be the estrogen receptor. Receptors are made of proteins. Right. And the steroid hormones are derivatives of cholesterol. So I should just say that the steroid hormone that you produce in any particular tissue depends on the presence of specific enzymes that will convert cholesterol into whatever the end product is, whether it's cortisol in the adrenal gland or estrogen in the ovaries. And so the hormone is going everywhere. It's getting into your cells. And when it gets into, say, when testosterone gets into a cell, and there is a receptor for testosterone inside that cell, the receptor exists inside the cell, not on the surface of the cell, like an insulin would interact with a receptor that's on the surface of the cell. It can't get into the cell because it's a protein hormone. It's not lipophilic. But so testosterone can get right in there. It interacts with its receptor. And what I find really fascinating is that hormone receptor complex then travels into the cell nucleus, and it acts as what is called a transcription factor, which means that androgen receptor has a little sort of spot on it that allows it to bind the really close to the specific gene that it is going to modulate. So androgens actually can increase or sometimes decrease gene transcription, which means increase the rate at which various proteins are produced. So you have a beard because you have, or whatever you have, stubble.
I just shaved a couple of days ago. This is 3 days of growth. So
that's not bad.
Give me a week and it'll be, much more filled out.
So that's because your testosterone is getting into cells that are in your hair follicles and upregulating the genes that produce the proteins that are necessary to do the work of producing this dark, thick hair. So steroids are super, have these really profound and long-lasting can exert these profound and long-lasting changes and coordinate all these different systems in the body, like puberty, because they can go around to all these different cells in your whole body and change the rate at which genes are transcribed and translated into proteins. So that is super powerful, and it's your brain and your body. So your behavior, you'll get muscles at the same time you get sperm and an aggressive libidinous tendency, in puberty. That's because it can have these really widespread, systemic, long-lasting changes.
But just tell me why I can have them in my beard and hair follicles on my face, but not on my head anymore. Because this is something that people sometimes wonder is, I've lost my hair now on my head, which I'm perfectly fine with, but it's not working on these dead cells anymore on top of my skull.
Well, it is working. It's the testosterone is inside those cells, converted by the enzyme 5-alpha reductase into dihydrotestosterone, otherwise known as DHT, which gets into those hair follicles and screws up the growth cycle. It lengthens that growth cycle in there, and bye-bye hair.
It's okay.
But it's part of masculinity.
That's fine. No, I'm definitely okay with it. I'm securing it now. You mentioned secondary sex characteristics. And so you maybe just keep going on with that a little bit about how we have in utero, and then, we're kids, and then we reach 12, 13, and we're sexually maturing, or we're at the age of, where we can sexually reproduce, if you will. And so we have, at least for men with testosterone, typically you have, physical strength, so muscles, bones, your voice changes, becomes deeper, stronger libido, more aggressive tendencies, etc. What is the kind of evolutionary kind of game plan of right there at that time, all of this kind of comes online, and then there's a particular function, which is to have better reproductive value to get your genes into the next generation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But tell us about why that period and how testosterone works with secondary sex characteristics in puberty.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. And I just I got to throw in the red deer
Go ahead.
because, so I
this
took
is
this
from the one in your chapter
yeah,
in your book? Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
I took a trip out to the Isle of Rum in Scotland to watch the red deer. This is a very famous study site. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but it's a very famous study site. There's a huge amount of data that comes from this population of red deer. There's over 40 years of data on basically how sexual selection affects the behavior of these deer. And there's also a lot of data on testosterone and how it regulates their anatomy and physiology and behavior in this very coordinated way. And so what's interesting, first of all, about humans is that you go through puberty and that's it. You have high testosterone after that, and you retain the features that promote male reproduction, right? So you retain your weaponry, basically, which is these, big muscles. You retain a high sex drive. And so you can't see in humans the effects of testosterone coming and going. You can sort of see the effects of estrogen and progesterone in women if you pay attention and you're in a long-term relationship and you start to notice changes across the cycle, right? But in the red deer, so I got to go during the rut, which is the time when the females come into estrus. This is the main point about what testosterone does in animals. It upregulates these features in males when the females are fertile, right? You don't want to waste energy on all of these traits. They're very expensive calorically, right? Testosterone causes your energy to be diverted to male-male competition. You don't want to do that if there's no females who can get pregnant.
Right.
So in humans, you've got this sort of permanent masculinization, and you're making sperm, obviously, which is incredibly important. You don't want to make sperm if you're not going to have the muscles and the aggression and the libido to use the sperm, right? Mm-hmm. So in the red deer, what is so cool is you can see during the rut, the antlers have grown and are very sharp and will be used by the animal to try to maim, poke out the eyes, stab their competitors, right? So they have weapons on their head that are glorious to see. They are testosterone mediated. During the rut, which is in October, the testes are upregulated. Their function is upregulated. Sperm start being made. The libido goes way up. Males go from living peacefully together, not having much of a sex drive, not having any weaponry. Testosterone goes up. They have sperm. They have weapons. They have muscles around their neck to fight. They have a big sex drive. They are totally motivated to ascend the status hierarchy and kill the stags that they were just living with peacefully because of testosterone changes in changing over time in this seasonal way that you can see, right? So we can't see it in men. But that is basically, we don't have antlers, obviously, but that's something similar is going on, but it's sort of set at puberty and then lasts through much of adulthood, where you're getting those changes that to some degree fluctuate in other animals that are seasonal breeders in these really interesting, dramatic ways. You can see that in birds. You can see that in lots of different animals. So that is what's going on in puberty. It's that you get this coordination of this elaboration of the reproductive system. Once sperm come online, everything else needs to come online. You're not going to make sperm if you're not going to be motivated to use the sperm, and you're not going to be able to use the sperm unless you first, compete for status in whatever way makes sense in a given environment. You may have the musculature. That doesn't mean that you're going to go around beating people up, right. But it means you still have that large body size, which is generally attractive to females. And you've taken long enough. In humans, you need a certain amount of time. We need a lot compared to other animals to grow and learn to get to a point. Like my son is 12. He is still doing a lot of rough and tumble play. And he's not like a super boyish boy, but he loves tackling his friends still. And they do a lot of play fighting. And there's a lot of learning that has to take place in juvenility in all kinds of different animals, and having high testosterone in utero promotes rough and tumble play in males. I did a little bit of rough and tumble play, but nowhere near as much as what most boys do. Not all boys do it, and some girls do it, and there's a lot of variation. But, so the idea is that there's been enough learning and enough maturity, physically and psychologically, for the individual to now become sexually viable. It doesn't all happen right away, but things start coming online and people start experimenting and becoming, the libido goes up, obviously, and physical aggression may or may not go up because there's a fair amount of physical aggression even in boys, but generally that's increases, and obviously libido increases, and the desire to compete for mates. Or to get the resources needed to attract mates. And we know what those resources are in humans. A lot of it is money.
I think that
or status, it depends.
Sure.
On the
Yeah.
environment.
I think one of the things about differences with other animals with humans is that males don't know when fellow females are fertile. We don't see it like we do,
Exactly.
we do with our cousin apes, or with birds, or with, like you're saying.
Yeah, you got to be ready to go all the time.
Right, and we just don't know, and that's there's obviously unique differences in our evolutionary tree of sorts of how humans have to. We don't really know, and so there's always this kind of being on in terms of once we hit puberty. Okay.
Unless you are pair bonded, some very different things happen in humans when you're pair bonded, and we're one of 5% of mammals in which men invest, the males invest in their offspring, and that can suppress testosterone. So there's a lot less aggression in men because of those pair bonds and the need to be nurturing and increase your reproductive success through pair bonding and nurturing behavior. So that's a plastic strategy there.
Yeah, I believe testosterone decreases the longer in males, the longer they're pair bonded with a partner throughout their life form, because they just don't need to use it as much anymore.
It depends. Yeah. Especially when the babies come, if the males are physically involved and actually providing physical care, then there is that suppression somewhat of testosterone.
I have to ask you about this one part in the book because it absolutely blew my mind. Is the Mullerian ducts and the Wolffian ducts. It was just the pictures, the illustrations were absolutely essential. Very, very helpful.
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to work in a podcast, but
it's probably not going to work as much without the visuals, but we'll try. I don't know. I just hadn't. I heard or talked to or read some of the stuff that you had set up to that point. I was like, okay, this tracks. And then for some reason, I just personally never, maybe I was asleep in biology class.
Oh God, I didn't know it before I started learning about this in grad school.
So tell us what they are, the two ducts, and how they are similar in a unique way, how they're different too, but how there's an interesting similarity there, which is just the first time you hear it, it's strange. It just kind of hits you.
Yeah. So I want to make clear, we're not talking about quack, quack ducts.
Yes. DUCTS ducts.
Okay. So I found this fascinating when I first learned about it too. And yes, having the illustrations might be helpful, but let's see how this works.
Yeah.
So I talked about, and this, I didn't know this either, that at 6 weeks, I guess I had sort of imagined, even though I never thought about it really explicitly, that we had sort of separate precursors to ovaries and then to testes, and maybe one develops or something like that. But that's not what happens. You have one set of structures that can go one way or the other, depending on whether S or Y is present, right? So that's what happens with the gonads that are undifferentiated and can become either testes or ovaries. All right. Now, here's the interesting part about the internal reproductive structures. I'm just going to say, I will say fallopian tubes and vas deferens, although those aren't the names that they start with. So for the males, there is a set of ducts, a duct system called the Wolffian duct. And I'm just going to say that there's other structures that the Wolffian duct ultimately become in males, but I'm just going to talk about the vas deferens because it's simple. So the vas deferens, in case people don't know, is the analogous structure to the fallopian tubes that connect the gonads basically to the outside world. But in the case of females, to the uterus. So obviously in the females, you've got to get the egg from the ovary. It's fertilized in the fallopian tubes typically, and then migrates down the fallopian tubes and implants in the uterus, or it just comes out during the woman's period, right? So that's what the fallopian tubes do. And we, of course, have our gonads inside of our bodies, but testosterone causes the descent of the gonads in about the 7th month of human pregnancy into the scrotal sac. And so you've got to then get up from the testes out through the urethra, right? You've got to get the sperm, the male gametes up and out into the world. Ideally, you know, from an evolutionary perspective, into a woman's reproductive tract. Okay, so that's what the vas deferens does. So after the gonads differentiate into the testes or ovaries, the ovaries don't really produce hormones that are necessary for female reproductive development. That just proceeds if it's not inhibited. Okay, so we have these two sets of ducts. One set called the Wolffian duct, and like wolf to me is a little more masculine somehow. That's how I tell my students to remember it. So the Wolffian duct system will become the internal duct system, like the vas deferens, for men if testosterone is present. It is necessary to stabilize and maintain that and develop that duct system, the Wolffian ducts. And testosterone is going to be present if the gonads differentiate into testes. Those testicular cells start producing testosterone, and that is what stabilizes that duct system and develops it into the adult male system of the vas deferens. If you don't have testosterone, that whole Wolffian duct system just sort of goes away. It does not develop. And you might have even if you're male, if for some reason your androgen receptors aren't working, you're something amiss with your testosterone production, even if you have testes, if the testosterone isn't adequate or the receptors for testosterone aren't adequate, that duct system is going to go away. That doesn't mean you're not male. It means you just don't have that internal system as an adult. And this actually happens in some males. Another thing, so then for a typical male, the testes will also produce a hormone called Mullerian inhibiting hormone that causes the degeneration of the Mullerian ducts. Right? So the testes have to produce two things for normal male development: testosterone and Mullerian inhibiting hormone. For some males, they produce testosterone, but they have a problem, maybe a genetic defect, producing Mullerian inhibiting hormone. So the Mullerian ducts end up developing, right? So there's no ovaries, but those ducts, the fallopian tubes, say, could develop. That's called persistent Mullerian duct syndrome. So for normal, typical male development, you've got to have testosterone and Mullerian inhibiting hormone to make the female Mullerian duct system go away and to develop the male duct system into the adult system. Females, it's just going to develop unless inhibited by this hormone from the testes, MIH. So female, again, is in some sense the default in terms of the external genitalia, the vagina, et cetera, and even the internal plumbing will just sort of develop by default unless all this stuff goes right, unless the testes do everything that they have to do to inhibit the development of the female duct system.
I don't know.
Did that answer your question?
I don't know if it's more, if it blows my mind more when you explain it or reading you write or having read what you wrote about it. It's crazy how, again, in the book, I mean, the way you explained it was great, but that there's this in the book. It's wild because much of the parts that men and women have, because they're kind of with the same, if you will, programming initially.
Yes.
The penis and the clitoris are not that different. They're just,
they come from the genital tubercle. From one structure that under testosterone is going to go the penis direction. Under no testosterone, it's going to go the clitoris direction.
Right. And then you have like your early scrotum, and then you have the like labia majora and minora. Like, again, it's coming from the same, like
it's the same stuff. But that's different with the internal ducts because we have two pairs. One has to go away, one has to be developed. And with the genitalia, it's like, no, you've just got this one set of structures, for the penis or the clitoris that's just going to go either way, kind of like the gonads can go either way. But then you have these two, pairs of ducts for the internal stuff.
Again, absolutely fascinating. Blows my mind. Blows my mind. The body is wild. Okay. I want to ask about socialization. We've already touched on it. So I guess the one big thing, and you give examples in the book from lab examples, I believe, of rats and guinea pigs who were treated with testosterone. And I guess the question I have is how we understand testosterone or hormones in general, how they can affect behavior by affecting social interactions. Which is changing the behavior? Is it the testosterone or is it the social interaction? Is it, a combination of two? Do we not know how to parse out one or the other, which comes first? Again, this might be a chicken or the egg kind of thing, but when we're talking about this in utero and postnatal, how do we understand these gendered expressions of how testosterone works with the social environment and for various behaviors, et cetera?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the answer is it's not chicken and the egg. There are reciprocal interactions between hormones and the social environment that are very important and can be very profound. However, we do not start as blank slates gender-wise. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's not chicken or the egg. And that is because there's very clear evidence from, first of all, non-human animals. There is no question that early exposure to testosterone in utero, so if there are testes, there's going to be testosterone in utero, and that shapes the brain in ways that predispose an animal for masculine, typically physical behavior with more aggression, more rough and tumble play. This is before puberty. That's a super common across many different taxa, and especially we can see this clearly in mammals. And there's tons of observational evidence and experimental evidence that you can manipulate typically masculine behavior in juvenility by manipulating the pre or directly postnatal androgen environment. So that's super clear. And if humans were somehow exceptions to this rule, that would be weird, right? Because we are subject to the same evolutionary pressures as everybody else. So that would be bizarre if that didn't happen. So I think the default assumption should be that, yes, this happens in humans also, but we don't just have to go on this default assumption. We have a lot of evidence. We can't manipulate what's going on in the prenatal environment in humans, but we can look at evidence from people who have atypical exposure to androgens in utero. And there are a bunch of different cases of that. And the one that has the most research behind it is the case of congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where female fetuses are, because they have a disorder in their adrenal gland, essentially produce too much testosterone in utero. And I shouldn't say too much. They produce higher levels than average for an average female of testosterone. And this condition is usually if these girls are born in places with adequate medical care, this is corrected at birth. So the hormone levels are normalized right at birth. They can have enlarged clitorises that can sometimes look like penises. However, they're female. They are typically raised as female, especially where they have adequate medical care. They're generally always raised as female because it's clear that they are female. And but what we see in these girls relative to girls who don't, typical girls who don't have congenital adrenal hyperplasia or CAH, is that these girls have a much higher, first of all, rate of rough and tumble play relative to girls who don't have CAH. They're much more interested in physical play with boys. They're much more interested in playing with the toys that boys like. They're much more likely to want to play with boys. They're not just like boys in terms of the rates of these typically masculine behaviors, but they're masculinized. And the obvious interpretation, although a lot of people argue against this, it's an obvious interpretation because we have so much evidence that this is exactly what happens in non-human animals. Of course, we don't have the toys, but we have the rough and tumble play. We know we can increase that by increasing prenatal testosterone. We see the same patterns in humans. These studies have been replicated over and over again in many different kinds of studies in different environments. So there's also the case where we have people who are XY, who have testes, who produce high levels of testosterone, but that testosterone is not recognized by their body because their androgen receptors don't work. This is called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. And these people are extremely feminine in their behavior. There's no evidence of masculinization at all. And they had zero testosterone influence in their brain or bodies prenatally. Of course, they look female and they're, socialized as female. So you could say, well, that's of course because they're socialized as female. But the CAH girls are also socialized as female, but they have a predisposition to increased masculine behavior. So that is some evidence from humans that is just entirely consistent with what we see in non-human animals. So I would say, yeah, males are typically born with a predisposition for certain types of masculine behavior. That shapes their environment shapes them, and also that the social environment can have a profound effect on hormones, especially in adulthood, when males, for instance, are threatened or they're in a competitive interaction that can cause increases in testosterone. And there can be responses to the outcome of a competitive interaction, whether it's physical or non-physical, where testosterone levels change based on who is perceived as the winner or the loser. So the idea is that the loser of a sort of intense status interaction can have a testosterone decline relative to the winner. And that we don't fully understand what that's about, but in non-human animals, the evidence suggests that that's about conditioning that animal to respond to future competitive threats as a winner and take on a challenge, or kind of as a loser and to flee or react with fear and anxiety rather than dominance and boldness. And that is something that testosterone seems to regulate in the short term. Those changes seem to be very important in behavior and much less important than baseline individual differences like among males, where if I knew, among my students, if I knew the testosterone levels of all the young men in the room, it wouldn't really tell me anything about their level of physical aggression or how libidinous they are. You can have very high testosterone and be totally monogamous and, not have a high libido or be physically aggressive, and the reverse with a lower testosterone person within the normal range. But I think it's these shorter term changes in testosterone that are probably really important.
Aside from the examples you gave, so let me just push back a little bit here on the counter. How do we know that this isn't part of one's environment or their socialization? When you see a child that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 18 months, 12 months, and they're in a certain family makeup, or they're in a certain environment, whether it's a poor one or a good one, or adaptive, maladaptive, etc., or the exposure they have to certain things, etc. How do we not know that that's not the reason for some of these expressions? So go ahead. Yeah, tell me.
That's easy. So first of all, there is the parsimonious explanation, which is what is the sort of cleanest link between that requires the fewest assumptions between the evidence, say, and the hypothesis. So the evidence from non-human animals, experiments, observation, evolutionary logic, I think the parsimonious explanation is that what we observe in humans is for the same reason and due to the same mechanisms, basically, that it is in non-human animals. So that's point one. Point two is pretend we didn't know everything that we know about evolution and how we see testosterone working in non-human animals. That is very, very similar to what we see in humans. To pretend that doesn't even exist. Then you need to explain why it is that is in every single culture ever where we look at sex differences in something like rough and tumble play, why aren't there any exceptions to the rule that boys do it more than girls? We see that everywhere. That would be an amazing, bizarre coincidence that requires explanation of why every single culture, boys are sort of conditioned to like rough and tumble play, right? That requires explanation. That's a much more difficult explanation that requires more sort of leaps of logic than the one that I've given you, which is that boys are born with a predisposition relative to girls, just like, rats and lizards and chimps, to enjoy physical play. And so that is my answer. There's just overwhelming evidence, especially, historically, cross-culturally. This is just a super robust, consistent finding. And it is never the case that girls do this more than boys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
On average.
Yeah, on average.
Yeah,
on average. Yeah. I mean, obviously you have individual differences and stuff, but
yes,
we have
and lots of overlap.
Yeah, lots of overlap. But there was a couple weeks ago we had some folks come over, and there was some people that came over that had a so almost 2-year-old girl, and then they had a 2-year-old boy. So very close in age. And again, individual differences aside, et cetera, they're raised in different, not wildly different environments, but different cities. Just the behaviors were just very different. The small boy was getting into everything, knocking stuff over, pulling this out, questioning this.
And the activity level was just generally higher.
Activity level was much higher. Yeah. Sweet boy. But just way more active, higher energy.
Yeah.
And the girl was more to herself, more looking around, observational, very gentle when she would pick things up. Just wildly different. And again, those are.
Yes, of course you can get girls that are like the boy you just described, and you can get boys that are like the girl you described.
Right.
But what you describe is typical of what people observe.
The typical way in which you would say, yeah, that sounds about right. And there's nothing, I don't think odd about that. But it is interesting that some folks will try to, overemphasize, one more than the other, maybe for various motivations, but. And what you're saying, both in what we know about biology, evolution, cross-culturally, all around the world, all of these things, unless we are created with intelligent design or something that makes us different from how we understand evolution, it doesn't seem to fit necessarily so well. I mean, there's nothing really special about us in one way. There are some things that make us, a little bit different, but we fit within nature. We fit within the evolutionary tree, just like our cousins in the great apes, and just like many other mammals, and we fit within this kind of taxonomy of those things work for them, and those parts are for us as well. I mean, obviously there's with each species there's difference, but there's enough things in the kind of programming that says this is the functioning of mammals, this is the functioning of primates, this is the function of social mammals, etc. So it seems to be that it would be a hard turn to say, yeah, except humans, not for us.
Yeah. And I just want to give just one more example, since we're talking about the behavior of kids. And so assume that, so obviously the kid, so take the boy who's running around. So just say he's 5 years old, right? Say he's running around, he's getting into stuff, he's yelling, he's breaking things, he's being a big pain in the butt, right? And suppose the parents are kind of not really disciplining him, right? We could all agree that the 5-year-old has an increased predisposition relative to you or me, right? To engage in that type of behavior. That's sort of what a kid will do unless the environment restrains that behavior, right? So we can all agree there is a biological predisposition for little kids to run around, screaming or breaking stuff or whatever you want to imagine. Right. That is because of their biology, right? That's not because of culture. That's what they come with. That's who they are as 5-year-olds. That's what they want to do. That is their nature. However, their expression of that nature is 100% almost, unless there's a disorder or something, dependent upon the culture, on the religion, on the family, on the whoever's house they're in, what they had for breakfast. Everything in the environment so heavily impacts how they express that nature. And I think sex differences are very, very similar. We are born with different predispositions on average, but the environment is everything. Like, it's incredibly important. So people oppose biological explanations because they think it means that people are going to view the culture as not being important, and that we just have to accept patriarchy and accept bad male behavior, say. But we don't. That's ridiculous. If you just look at the evidence and we focus on really clear science education and how to understand the implications of our biology, that is where the hope is. That is where the understanding is. People are trying to alter the facts to suit political agendas, and it's a huge mistake. We're going in the wrong direction. And that is part of why I wrote the book, because it's so clear. The truth is not threatening. The truth is hope and a way forward. If you understand how biology interacts with the environments, we can do a much better job on getting to where we want to be in terms of equity and, justice and safety, or whatever political, social goals we have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally hear you, and I agree with you. I think that's that's super important, and I think that's I believe the science education is super important, but to do it in a way where we can really try to navigate better a complicated world where there are many horrible things, and we can't do that if we can't hang our hat on a few facts. Core facts of things,
basic
and
facts.
Also understand the cultural, environmental components as well, and we have to do both. And so my last question for you is pretty much just that: how do we understand that complicated role that culture and hormones and testosterone, and you can broaden it out to masculinity, femininity, have on sexuality between men and women, or even different types of unions? How do we make sense of all that? How do we try and navigate through some of these tough waters at times?
Yeah, so that's a huge question, and I cannot give you a complete answer. And we've already talked about some of this, but I guess the perspective that I have, which I've has become much more important to me throughout the research and writing and sort of talking about this book, is to, yes, we want to judge behavior, right? We want to control, to the extent possible, behavior, right? But in terms of understanding human nature, whether it's more feminine or more masculine or something in between, or whatever it is we're dealing with, we've got to start by asking questions and trying to understand the challenges that individuals face, obviously, but that people face that are, say, typically masculine issues or typically feminine issues that are challenges in terms of regulating our behavior. The social, like, women do not get what it's like to be a man, and men do not get really what it's like to be a woman. Of course, that's an eternal problem. I'm trying through my book to get into the male, I don't want to say body and behavior, but in a way I just really, really want to use the most powerful lens I can to understand what shapes masculinity, and then to understand some of the challenges that men face that I, throughout most of my life, have been extremely judgmental about. And sometimes, there's a lot of wonderful aspects of being a man or being masculine that are pro-social that people don't tend to appreciate, like physical heroism, for instance, which men, are much more represented in the group of people who risk their own lives to save the lives of even people they don't know. And that's just one example. But the point is, there are also challenges that men face that are sometimes annoying to be, or dangerous, obviously, to be on the receiving end of. But rather than just judging and shaming, I really think it's important to try to understand and allow conversation about men's reality to try to solve whatever problems we're facing socially and that men feel they can't even talk about sometimes. So I think at least we need to have conversations and try to understand what motivates behavior ultimately, and what we can do to make it, better, I guess. So it's sort of understanding before judgment, I guess.
Yeah, that is absolutely encouraging to hear. I think if there's many people like yourself that are curious to understand experiences that you're not going to understand, and vice versa, I think we can be much better in how to deal with men and women and
more compassionate overall.
More compassionate, more patient,
yeah.
And more understanding, and we need that. And so I'm so grateful for the work you do, what you've the book you've written, and everything else. And so where can people find you? Where can they get your book, all that good stuff?
Okay, so I'm have a website, which is pretty low key, but it's carolehooven.com, CarolHooven.com. And I'm on Twitter at Hoovlet, HOOVLET. I don't have Instagram or anything yet. I don't really understand it. But I'll try to do that eventually. And yeah, anywhere books are sold, Amazon, where, if you don't want to do Amazon, anywhere else that books are sold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The book is T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. Carole, thank you for your passion, your honesty, your balance. All of it is such a bright voice, and we need that. And so I greatly appreciate you coming on and talking about this stuff.
Thank you so much. This has really been a pleasure. Thank you.
Same. Thank you.